Thanks very much. Thanks for hosting us. You began saying to support McNally. I would absolutely recommend supporting McNally because New York City would not be the same for my generation if it was not because of McNally. But I would say too, buying natural history is something you should do right now. I just read the translation in these last days, the amazing translation of Megan McDowell, whom we know well, she has translated Alejandro Zambra. I may be wrong, Carlos, but I think that she did Samantha Schwelbin too.
Samantha Schwelbin, Mariana Enriquez, Lina Meruane.
Lina Meruane, yes, so she's a taste maker. She is obviously the upcoming strong voice for Latin American literature in English and a very respectful translator. Since I read Coronel Lágrimas, the first novel of Carlos Fonseca, it's very weird to be speaking to a computer, people. Sorry, I'm used to teaching the computer, but not to talk to Carlos in a computer, but I will do the best I can. The first time since I read for the first time Carlos' books, I was impressed by the mathematical elegance of his style, and a style that is just lean and just flows from really unexpected places to really unexpected places, with one never jumping while he does these virtuoso acrobatics of prose. This translation of Megan McDowell, it's impressive in that sense. I think that she gets perfectly your voice, Carlos. And as usual, when I read a book in translation, I learned a lot. I'm sure that you learned a lot working with her in the translation too, as you are an English speaker. But I learned a lot about your novel, about English, even about Spanish. And I discovered many things in the novel that I had not seen in the Spanish version, thanks to her work. So thank her, thank McNally, and of course, thank your publishers at FSG that are bringing this extraordinary new Latin American writing to the United States. Natural History, it's a novel. It's not a super voluminous novel, but it's a serious novel. I don't know how the people feels about it, but I like big novels. I like novels that you have to sit down. A novel must be demanding, and a novel must be challenging. And Natural History, it's a very pleasant challenge. It's an extensive novel, a novel that reviews the history of a family, a novel that is divided. Let me use Bolaño because I think that I could smell the faint smell of Bolaño's prose, not the prose, but some of his way of catching things in the air in your book that is so bookish. It's not about a book about the world. It's a book about books, I think, or it's a book for lovers of books. But anyway, the novel has 5 parts. The first part is the part of the narrator, in which an insomniac man receives 4 envelopes, and he knows what is more or less in the envelopes, but he will not open them until the sun rises. So it is a very long night. Then the second part is and in that part, a fascinating character, Giovanna, is introduced. In the second part, the story of her father, a Sepharad Jewish from Israel, and a photographer, is told his trip from Israel to Spain, from then to New York, and then to the depths of Latin America, that I suppose that is Guatemala, because there is a reference there to the infamous General Rios Montt. No, there is only one tiny, I was wondering all the time, is he in Chiapas? Are the characters in Costa Rica? Because Carlos is from Costa Rica. But at the end, I understood that they were in Guatemala. Then there is a third part that is the part of the mother, in which a fascinating story of a woman that could be a con artist or an artist, and I was convinced, I don't know what you expected from me, I believe her, is judge, and a jury has to decide in Puerto Rico if she's a con artist or an artist. Now, it's a fascinating part of the novel in which theories of the art, theories of perception, and a lot of political ideas are discussed. And then there comes the beautiful, I would say, more Latin American part, but at the same time, more Conradian part, that is the part of the girl, the woman that had been Giovanna introduced to us in the first chapter as an adult that is dying, is introduced to us as a child in the jungle. That chapter is just mesmerizing, impressive, and shows, I think, how many books you need to read to be able to write a book, if you are that kind of author, of course, because that literature comes from everywhere. And then there is a last fifth part in which the narrator that finally has been able to sleep grabs up the novel. It's a fascinating novel. It's a novel that, of course, refers to Bolaño and Cortázar, of course, that has references to, there is one character of Carlos Fuentes, for example. You know, there is, it's very libresque, but the panorama, the panorama that it presents of what was called in the 80s and 70s the lettered city of Latin America is enormous. No? There is a moment in which the reader will have the eyes of Bernal Díaz del Castillo seeing the city of Tenochtitlan in November 1519, for example. No? There is a moment in which there will be, I insist, many references to Conrad, the Latin American Conrad, the Conrad of Nostromo, I think, of course, the other Conrad too, etc., etc. It's really a brilliant, dense, tremendously intelligent, and disquieting book that has disquieted my peace in two consecutive times. No, first in Spanish and now in English. So thanks, Carlos. I have a first question for you. I already spoke, so now is your part. This is your part. You know, but I have a first question that is so silly, that is like really silly. But in which year you were born? I'm really interested in Latin America. Let me tell to our friends here in this computer, our little friends that are living in our computers now. In Latin America, you always have the author and the date of birth, no, the year of birth. And I was, since very early in the reading of the novel, wondering when were you born? Because I think, well, your narrator is older than you. No? I think that your narrator is my age and not your age. No? So I was, let me go through there. No? In which year were you born?
1987.
You are incredibly young. You are incredibly young. I ask this question because I would be interested, maybe because I'm Mexican, but I would be really interested in your approach to Marcos. Subcomandante Marcos was an essential figure for my generation. Then he vanished. He like lost impulse. My generation lost interest in him. And your novel makes, I think, an important work of reconstructing his image as a political figure of the internet era, of course, of a political figure for the millennial generation. Let's say. So there is, going through that, I understood that you were like presenting a political and literary panorama of Latin America from your generation, from the point of view of your generation. Were you conscious of that you were reading Marcos in a different way in which, for example, Octavio Paz read him, in a different way in which Enrique Krause read him, and in a different way in which, let's say, Juan Villoro read him, as I'm mentioning three like standard male intellectuals of the Mexican culture. No, your lecture of him and of everything else is different. Do you felt that you were working like with all material, proposing new ways of seeing it?
Yeah, so first of all, like, I want to thank McNally. It's wonderful to be back in McNally, particularly under these situations, and wonderful to be able to, like, talk to you, Álvaro. I think I have told you many times, and I have written it in Spanish, but it's now good to say it also in English. When I began thinking about the novel and how to, like, structure different, approaches to the novel in ways that went beyond the psychological approach or the psychological unity and coherence of the traditional novel, I found in your novels, a model. So it's wonderful to be in a conversation with you. Returning to the question regarding Subcomandante Marcos, it is interesting what you say, right? I was 7 years old when Subcomandante Marcos and the Zapatistas arrived in '94, right? So I couldn't, that was not my moment. Interestingly, I became much more interested in Marcos when he began his statement of disappearance, right? So 4 or 5 years ago, 6 years ago, he gives a speech from Chiapas in which he says, I have decided, no longer to be Subcomandante Marcos. I am in the process of disappearing. This was the moment that interested me. Subcomandante Marcos was a figure constructed for the media. And there he begins to construct a whole theory about the media and how the media works and how politics of the media was central for the Zapatistas that I found fascinating. And I found that tied very neatly with a certain politics of both anonymity, visibility, invisibility that interested me in relationship to the other characters of natural history. As you said, natural history is a novel about this family, a family that coming from the north decides to take a journey throughout the Latin American jungle in 1978. And in relationship to this jungle, this family begins to construct a theory of camouflage, a theory of what it means to become, part of your environment, visible or invisible, right? And how, for example, sometimes we gain, our own identities with regards to, the environment, like a chameleon. So that sort of reflections tied very neatly with how I saw Subcomandante Marcos. But as you completely and very kind of like adequately and smartly say, from a reflection that starts with the late Marcos, the Marcos of a poetics of disappearance, the Marcos that becomes suddenly Subcomandante Galeano, rather than the Marcos that starts, in 1994. So it's a reflection upon a different Marcos and an attempt to then retrospectively reread that Marcos with regards to a politics of nature in Latin America, to a politics of, the face, a politics of visibility, invisibility, anonymity, and so on.
I began there, and I began in the generational thing because I think that you saw something that no one else could see or that I have not read. That is the obvious fact, but it's only obvious for me after reading natural history, that Marcos was always a fiction character, that he designed him. We understood, that he was fighting his battles, his social revolution, that I think that had universal support and sympathy immediately and still has. But we understood that he was writing this new media that was the internet better than anyone in his moment. No, he was the first guerrilla fighter in the internet, and in that sense, he's like an apostle, to use a word that appears frequently of your novel, as an apostle of the left in the internet. No, corporations and the American government are giving us this, and we will subvert it and use it as a guerrilla. We understood that, but what looks so clever to me is that he really thought about himself, as he constructed himself as a fiction character. So when he appears in a novel, he just fits all right. And then I have this second question. Marcos is a real character, and some of the characters there in the novel are come from reality. Men, I am not the kind of reader that would have Google open next to him while he's reading. In fact, I only enter to the computer in the summer to talk to you, to have the privilege to present this book and talk to you, or to have a meeting from the university or things like that. I am not very attached to my computer. So I didn't Google your characters. But there are all these artists, for example, in your novel that have amazingly interesting proposals. Some of them, the three Argentinians that work with the notion of fake news long before the nightmare in which we are immersed now, and in a positive way, I may say too, they I think are real, but many others of your poets and characters are real or not. Can you speak about that, about generating that universe of like conceptual artists that I believed was real?
Yeah, this would be very interesting to talk to you, because you also do a lot of, right, like your characters come in a way from history, and that's something that I learned a lot from your novels, right? It's like how to write a historical novel that is not at all the historical traditional novel, right? What to do with these characters that come from reality, but that suddenly are placed within a completely fictional setting that doesn't belong just to the historical novel. And as you
This
say,
poet that dresses like a clown and
yeah,
and reads poems for Vallejo, for example. I was on my knees. No, it's so fun, so interesting. No, so sorry, I interrupted you.
it's interesting, right? Like we can, as readers, we can always spot those moments of reality within a text. They almost kind of like jump out at us. And as you say, for example, the three Argentine conceptual artists, Jacobi, Escari, and Costa, were three, his conceptual artists that existed in the 1960s, 1970s in Argentina. And already, Álvaro, in the 1970s, they were beginning to think about what they call el arte de los medios, the art of the media. And they were beginning to think how within our kind of contemporary media world, the mediatic world, truths and public truths are constructed via the media by belief rather than just by objectivity. So what did they do? They decided to stage a happening. Happenings were, quite fashionable back then. So they decided to stage a happening, but they didn't. They just gave the media the documentation of this fake happening that had never happened. And immediately the media and the newspapers began circulating this news as if it had been a real thing, right? And through that, they began to show how the media was able to construct, in a way, fake news, right? Fast forward 3 decades later, and you have the whole post-truth discussion. But in a way, already it's Latin American artists. So to think that there was a Latin American discussion regarding post-truth and fake news and everything already in the 1960s, 1970s was interesting for me. This was 5 or 6 years ago when I was writing the novel before Trump arrived and everything became fake news. He kind of
your
coined
first minister, no, your first minister, man.
Yeah, of course, also Boris Johnson, the kings of the fake news. But I was interested in that, and as you said, then I decided to take that aspect of reality, that historical truth, and I kind of projected it upon a character, the character of Virginia McAllister, which is the mother of the story, which, as you mentioned, basically does a conceptual art piece that is inserting fake news into the media in order to mess up with the financial markets, and she's brought into trial, right? And I was interested in this movement of being brought into trial.
This is not historical at all, right? This is fiction. I never knew what to believe and what to not. This is fiction.
No, this is also historical. So okay. You remember 5 years ago, it was the moment when Maria Kodama, who runs the estate of Jorge Luis Borges, was suing a couple of authors, right? So this got me interested because I remember reading back then news that said okay, Pablo Kachatkan, who has been sued and brought to trial, has on the defense team Cesar Aira. And I said, this is fascinating to have Cesar Aira on your defense as your key defense witness. So that got me thinking about what would happen if we put an artist on trial, because in a way, the limit of art is defined there in the moment of judgment in front of the law. They have to define what is art and what is not, right?
It's fascinating. There is that meditation, no? So the idea of playing with fiction and reality, of playing in the borders of fiction and reality, was originally a leftist strategy. No?
Mm-hmm.
It was originally a revolutionary strategy that has been like cloned by the conservative thinkers or politicians of the world, and put at play. I think that in a more dangerous way, because the power that Marcos or all the characters, real and unreal, of your novel ever had was always symbolic. It was always real. No, there were not real guns behind. There was nothing. No, it was all like a revolutionary, a revolution of the imagination that somehow modified the reality. I think that in a beautiful way. I can tell you were 7, but I was already like 20 when that happened. The movement of the Mexican and Central American conscience, the moment in which the Zapatistas rise, was amazing. No, I would say that is the moment that marked the life of all the generations, from my parents to my children. No, that the reality really changed there, because they have an idea that you have writing this book, that is to attack the field of imagination and not the field of reality. I have another silly question. That is, you are an insomniac, right?
Yeah, particularly now with the COVID, it has become like horrible.
You don't tell me about it. The COVID and the summer, no, it's like it's one eternal plateau. I was reading your book, I was thinking this Carlos is insomniac too. No, instead of natural history, should be named a history of insomnia. And then it occurred to me that maybe what writers really are translator of insomnia, because I think that no one sleeps well in our circle. No? So maybe that world that is never safe, that world in which anything can happen, of fiction writing, comes from the fact that really no one never sleeps in our group of friends. No? So we are all always thinking in these middle territories. Your novel has masterfully, I would say, represented in the like written word that flow of the conscience of the person that is not being able to sleep and loses the ability to know if what she is seeing, it's a nightmare, it's a reality, or something in the middle. Your novel flows like a dream, and I can imagine how difficult technically was that, because it's never a dream. One is reading a real story in which I just asked you, are these people real? Can you speak a little bit about that world that comes and goes from the dream to the reality to the...
So now, and Álvaro, now that you say, first of all, I recognize now that all of my friends suffer from insomnia, at least the ones that like, right. But I think you're right. I think there is something about insomnia as an in-between space between, reality and like a dream-like fantasy, kind of like, imaginary or like a less fictional space. That in-betweenness, I think, was interesting for me. And I think there is also something crucial. I think like one of the reasons why we don't sleep well is that I think writers are obsessives. Writers are, like we get like fixed ideas and like, so, and when you think about the history of the novel is the history of fixed ideas, right? So it's Cervantes, following a fixed idea. It's Moby Dick following. It's Colonel Sutpen of Faulkner, right? So this and having a fixed idea and this almost absolute lucidity is so overwhelming that I think it perhaps can like lead to like insomnia, or it becomes a way of like metaphorically also like, you know, tying it into insomnia. The insomnia cannot sleep because the insomniac has become obsessed with some minor thing that perhaps has nothing to do with like the meaning of the world really, but at least he or she thinks that there might be like something if they follow this lead.
A thread to be felt, and your I was going there because your relationship to the literary traditions, and I'm saying traditions, not tradition, it's has an enormous scope. No, you just mentioned Faulkner, for example, and in the novel you land in Faulkner very clearly, but you land in Garcia Marquez too. That is,
Yeah.
and you land in Hemingway too. You land. I thought in the first part of the novel, for example, and the last one, in the voice of the narrator, there is of course the voice of or I thought of Paul Valéry's Messier Tête very
Yeah.
clearly. No, it's an obsessive man idea just circling and circling ideas. But then you go to the derivation of Messier Tête in Latin America, that is Salvador Elizondo's Farabeth. At the end of the novel, we see the gaze of the victim. That is what Salvador Elizondo did amazingly in Farabeth. And as one is reading your book, I found, of course, my personal references, no? Jose Revueltas, of course. I think that you are the only non-Mexican that has read Jose Revueltas in the world. And, well, and now, thanks to New Directions, we Americans can read a little bit, well, his masterpiece, that is El Apando, no? But anyway, one finds his or her or their own references in all over the book. So it's like you're using all the tradition. You know? And I really like that, because there is a moment in which those books that you read when you were young are returning to your ear through your voice. And then, of course, the voice of Megan McDowell. So it just becomes Borgesian, not just the layers keep growing. Were you feeling that you were writing the novel of your life, or you were just thinking in all these books while you were writing? Or is that your approach to books is that they come from books and not for reality? Can you speak about
Álvaro,
how you produce that enormous pleasure in a reader?
I think, like, you know, so at some point I said, well, this novel is going to be a long one. How can I structure it such that like the writing doesn't become boring, right? So I didn't want to write, you know, the 350 pages, the same style. And then I had an idea. I said, this is a novel really about camouflage, about mimicry, about, you know, getting one's, you know, identity through the other, right? Like The Mask, for example. And I said, what happens if I structure it in such a way, in order not to like get bored myself, each one of the different sections or the different parts of the novel is gonna be me kind of not copying, but imitating or reflecting upon one of the style of the authors that has influenced me, right? So that would be another way of like becoming like a chameleon, right? And I had a model there, which was Cabrera Infante. I don't know if you remember, but in Tres Tristes Tigres, yes, Cabrera Infante spends like a kind of chunk version in which he like tells the same story from the voice, mimicking the voice of each of the kind of canonical authors of the Cuban tradition, Lidia Cabrera, Jose Martí, Virgilio Piñera. And I loved it, this idea of like, you know, we writers tend to be obsessed with like the idea of the personal voice, la voz propia del autor. I like this idea perhaps of like, you know, finding oneself through another voice, or like, and this is what we do, you know, before we're writers, we're readers. And in a way, we are always channeling our own voices through another kind of tradition or traditions, as you say.
There is this. I will use like I always find Cortázar metaphor of boxing and writing like really bad. And I'm gonna use one even worse, that is driving. Your novel begins, you are driving a car in first, a gear car, of course, in first in a hill. No? It's a very cerebral, very French, or very 70s novel in which a character is thinking about himself, about his readings, about his failure, about his job, about everything. No? And then there is this moment in which you jump to sixth immediately, and the novel goes like a train. No, it's like it becomes a really fast novel. Were you thinking in changing the speed to which you are subjecting your reader when you grow?
Yeah, I think like, you know, like each section, like there was this worry about the style, about like each section I want to tell a different character, a different sort of like even narrative, right? And each one has to have its own speed, its own style. And even the, you know, the level of the chapters, right? When we reach the jungle, it is more condensed description, but they're shorter fragments, right? So like that was something. But as I say, like, you know, it's also a matter of like keeping oneself interested as a writer, right? So like while I was writing, I was like, you know, it would be interesting for me to like try in each of these sections, and then thinking about the reader, what is that going to happen, or what sort of effect that's going to have upon the reader, right? And since at the end of the day, this is basically one story, a voyage in the jungle that is refought in different kind of ways. It's, you know, it's the type of stuff that at the end of the day Faulkner was doing with the Silent Dying or something like that.
Or even more traditional, you know, it made me think, of course, in Rashomon, you know, to see the same thing through the very different points of view of everything, of everyone, and every time you see a different point of view of the same fact, it works like a revelation. I would stay chatting to you forever. There is this. There is this. Well, one more question, people. Sorry, one more question, and I dropped the mic. There is this thing about the for example, the camouflage. You know? How the character of the narrator discovers camouflage as a child, and then 200 pages later, one sees the girl character discovering camouflage in the same bog. And they do different discoveries. Your book works, proceeds, not up forward, because if it was going in a direction, it would be really going backwards or in circles. But it proceeds not as an arrow, I would say, but it proceeds through like bricks. It's like if different things rhymed with some parts of the books rhymed with another ones. It works like the Bible. I have this Catholic formation, and I always go back to there. But no, in which one miracle it's demonstrated as truth because of another miracle. Nothing really happened, but anyway, if there are these two similar miracles in two different stories, it must be real. My impression is that you operate that way, your story.
Yeah, and at this point, it's where like I feel like a lot of affinity with you. For example, I feel like I saw in your novels this capacity to work not like through the linearity of plot, but rather through like some sort of like almost correspondences or metaphoric resonances or kind of collections that you start building almost like a cabinet of curiosities, right? Like the Renaissance cabinet of curiosities. And in a novel like Natural History, I think like I was interested in like a little bit, you know, taking that procedure of like, you know, building a novel that like works through metaphoric resonances of camouflage at every single level in such a way that like, you know, the mask of Subcomandante Marcos could be in touch with like, you know, how Cubists were painting camouflage in the First World War, right? Because at the end of the day, at the level of language, they are the same.
That's just a crazy luxury. You know, we know this, when in all this discussion about camouflage and mimesis and vanishing and reappearing, comes Picasso having a conversation with Gertrude Stein, I was like, oh my God, he pulled it out. He pulled it out. No, it's a really brilliant book, Carlos.
Oh,
It's
thank you,
really
Álvaro.
brilliant. To the people in the hall, please read it, and you will enjoy it. Spare a time. It's serious writing, but also so it's not. I have read very dense novels in the beach, so I will not be against that. No, but it's serious, like ambitious Latin American writing. No, something sometimes in the later years I have been missing. No, these novels that are like full and the author will go as far as she can to produce a discourse. I need to a solid discourse. We need to open, I think, to the audience. I would love to monopolize this conversation forever, but no, please, if you have
Thank you,
any,
Álvaro.
you surely have many questions for Carlos, so I become the audience here and listen to you. Thank you.
That is such a beautiful endorsement of Carlos's book. Thank you, Álvaro. I do have a couple really good questions from the chat. One related to your insomnia, Carlos. Which time of day do you get your best writing done? Is it at night, in the morning? Are you a disciplined writer?
This will be an interesting answer for an insomniac, but actually in the morning. When I get a good sleep and I'm able to, begin the day early, I get to like very good writing. Or sometimes, actually in the middle of the night, sometimes the insomnia is produced by the moment of writing, but that usually is not so much the writing itself, but rather just sporadic ideas. Like, you jump out of bed and you're like, oh, let's, and then you have to check in the morning if they're good ideas or perhaps.
Do you have a notebook next to your bed?
No, well, the cell phone. Email to myself.
You spoke about some of the writers and books you love. Were there any books in particular that in the composition of natural history, were there any books that helped you solve a problem that you had with your book? Was there anything that you read that you sort of had an aha moment with?
Well, I can mention many books that have helped me with this sort of structure. At the beginning, I mentioned, I didn't want to make it a big deal because Álvaro was there, right? But now that he's part of the audience, I can say it. And definitely Álvaro's books, from one in Spanish that's called Cementerio de Sillas to, Sudden Death, helped me solve the question of how to write a long duration novel. So instead of just something that happens during, 2-3 years, right? How to span a big kind of chunk of time. The works of Ricardo Piglia, who is being published in the States by Restless Books, one of my favorite publishing houses, have always helped me think through narrative structure. Guillermo Cabrera Infante, the great Cuban novelist of Tres Tristes Tigres, which I think could translate as Three Trapped Tigers, really helped me think through this question of what does it mean to have a personal voice, and perhaps we can filter those voices through something else, like a ventriloquist would do. Álvaro mentioned at the beginning, and you also mentioned Roberto Bolaño. I think particularly 2666, that novel is just a tour de force of how to get a novel to explode everywhere, right? So, and that's something I'm very interested in. Piglia used to say, Borges taught us that any sort of story should or can be told in 5 pages. So the question is, what do we do with a novel, right? How do we legitimize the fact that we're using 400 pages, right? So one way of doing this is just telling stories and kind of exploding the stories from within in the sort of way that Don DeLillo, who is another author I really follow, would do. And I bet I'm missing so many. W.G. Sebald, that would be another person. Speaking of natural history, right? He's the one that finds in natural history and that idea of the collection of the cabinet of curiosities, a way of of organizing stories beyond the traditional way of the psychological novel. So this would be all Cristina Rivera Garza with her idea of necroescrituras as texts that like incorporate other texts. These were all like kind of things that I was at least reading while I was writing, and definitely had an influence.
I have a question. Is this the second book you've published this year? Did you publish a textbook this year?
I did publish an academic book, yeah.
I wondered, I saw that, I did a little digging. I was like, is that the same? It was Bloomsbury Academic.
Exactly.
It was like the literature of catastrophe or emergency, or I took a class at in college called the literature of extreme events, and I was like, oh, that'd be a perfect book to assign for that class. What was the process of, did you write that at the same time that you were writing your fiction?
Yeah, well, so like, you know, I wrote that as my PhD dissertation. And of course, I was writing fiction at the same time, right? I was like switching between one and the other. And there are some similarities, right? I was trying to think of nature, right? And nature does seem to be kind of the backdrop against which all of these events that happen in the novel can be narrated, right? And a type of reflection on like Latin America has been often been narrated or, you know, imagined through its nature. I come from Costa Rica, right? We're the paradise of ecotourism. So people see us and people see like, you know, the virgin jungle. And in a way, natural history tries to take that idea that comes from the romantics, even somebody like Alexander von Humboldt, and tries to like question it or turn it around and try to say, try to think, well, you know, nature is nature, but nature is also political. So what does it mean to think, you know, politics and nature together in the type of way that somebody like Subcomandante Marcos was doing or is still doing from, you know, the Lacandon jungle in Chiapas, Mexico. So that would be one way. It's strange with that book, The Literature of Catastrophe, because it has like, you know, I wrote it, it has chapters on volcanoes, earthquakes, and epidemics, and it just came out now with the epidemics. So I would have to rewrite the whole chapter if following what we're living.
I think I have time for two more questions. One more from the chat. Did you learn something from having written natural history, or was the writing of it more a vehicle for you to describe things you knew and wanted to get in a book? Was the writing of the book an act of discovery for you?
Yeah, I think like, you know, with writing, it's always an act of discovery. It's like, first of all, when you begin a novel, you never know if you're going to be able to finish it, right? Which is, it keeps the energy going. It keeps you like, you know, attempting to do something new. And I think like how I work, at least with this novel, is such that like, you know, I begin with a couple of ideas, and then these ideas begin to kind of constellate and build constellations that I had never imagined at the beginning, right? So for example, I was talking to Álvaro about the history of camouflage, and one of the things that I suddenly discovered was this fascinating, or at least fascinating to me, history of like the invention of camouflage in the First World War. So it happened to be the late 19th century, one impressionist painter called Abbot Henderson Thayer. It begins to like, you know, explore with painting ideas of shading and counter shading. And he begins to like, you know, discover in the animal kingdom, or he becomes very interested in how animals camouflage at moments of danger. He begins to like develop these ideas, and then during the First World War, he comes to like, you know, the British military and begins to show them, whoa, this could hypothetically be used for, you know, like military or political aims. And that's when like the French decide, well, we have all of these cubists that are trying to sell some paintings. Why don't we like, you know, hire them from, and this became the camoufleurs that were fundamental for, and that's the moment that Álvaro was saying, you know, that Picasso, he's with Gertrude Stein, and they see a camouflage tank pass through Paris, and then Picasso, of course, in a very egoist and narcissistic way says, I invented this is Cubism, right? So these are the type of findings that like you find while writing the novel, and that like become part of the collection or become part of the constellation.
Then my last question, given the times, have you found this period of self-isolation and all the rest, have you found it generative for your writing, or have you has it stalled your writing? What's your relationship to writing now?
Tell you the truth, I think it, as all of us, I think our relationship has changed throughout the months. The first ones were really hard to to write. I think like they were particularly, I couldn't even read too well. The insomnia was quite bad. I would be reading a lot of journals or like diaries. That's the type of kind of like small kind of fragmentary stuff that I could like read. But as the months have started progressing, I think like now like things have like it has become at least easier to try to like write again and to try to have that sort of attention that is required for it. So hopefully it will get better.
Well, thank you so much, Carlos.
I have one thing to say. I have one very small thing to say, Carlos. That this must be the first big Latin American novel in which the main character lives in New Jersey. No, it's really a New Jersey novel. It's really a Latin American New Jersey novel. No, it all happens there. I think it's fantastic. It speaks about this new reality, the reloaded Latin America, the expanded Latin America. But no,
exactly.
so thank you for writing it. I really enjoyed it.
Wow.
And thank you both for letting us host you this way. And thank you everybody who tuned in. This was a lot of fun. Be well, everybody. Be safe and have a good night.